This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and today I'm bringing you part 3 of my Adventures in the Forgotten Realms limited review. This time around I'm doing the review in fewer videos because of the amount of time between the full set reveal and it being available online is very small. In fact, it will probably have just arrived on Magic Arena around the time this video goes up. So far we've taken a look at all the cards that aren't red and green, so today we're wrapping up the card by card portion of this review by looking at cards of those colors. Keep in mind this is a limited review and I'm not talking about other formats. Also, I use a letter grade system to help me sum up my thoughts on each card, and if you aren't sure what the grades mean, you'll find a guide in the description. Alright, let's get started with red. First up, it's Armory Veteran, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Orc Warrior at common, and as long as it's equipped, it has Menace. This has a fine baseline and becomes pretty scary when you stick equipment on him, as adding Menace to whatever other boost he's getting will be formidable, and this format has a lot of playable equipment, especially in red-white. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it is Barbarian Class, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon enchantment class. There's a cycle of 12 of these, one for each Dungeons & Dragons class in this set. And they're all enchantments that start out with some effect and at level 1, and you can level them up for more mana to get to level 2 and level 3 until you get all of the different effects. With Barbarian Class, when it starts out, it says if you would roll 1 or more dice, instead roll that many dice plus 1 and ignore the lowest roll. To get to level 2, you can pay 1 generic and a red, and it says whenever you roll 1 or more dice, target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains Menace until end of turn. And to get to level 3, you can pay 2 generic and a red, and creatures you control have haste. The base level of this one probably wouldn't be worth it all on its own, even with all the D20 stuff in this set. It just won't create a different outcome all that often, though obviously it does make those D20 cards a little better. Once you add level 2, you're getting a very real payoff for rolling dice, as +2/+0 and Menace is a huge deal, and then level 3 adding haste to the mix, regardless of dice being rolled, seems nice. So how good would this be if you just paid 6 upfront for all of this? Well, not amazing, but paying it in installments is obviously better. Still, I think your deck will be dependent enough on having dice effects that this won't really work in every deck, and even when it does, I don't see it being incredible. Because it's so dependent on dice, I think this needs a build around grade, because in your average red deck with like 3 to 4 dice effects, it probably isn't worth it. You probably need 7 or more to get there, and that probably means you're in blue-red, the color pair that's all about rolling dice, and this will fit pretty nicely into that deck. I think it will be a D in your typical deck in the format, and a C+ in a deck with some dice stuff going on. Next up, it's Battle Cry Goblin, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Goblin at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and a red, and goblins you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn, and it has a Pack Tactics ability, which means when it attacks, if you attack with power 6 or greater, you get some sort of effect, and in this case, you get a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. On its own, this is a 2-mana 2/2 that can pump its power and gain haste for 1 and a red, which is usually a pretty decent card in limited. The Pack Tactics effects here isn't the most impressive ever, but adding another body to the board that can have its power pumped can sometimes matter, and obviously if you end up with a lot of goblins, and there's a decent number of them in this set, this gets even better. I think goblins will be easy enough to get that I'm willing to give Battle Cry Goblin a B-. Next up, it's Boots of Speed, which for 1 red mana is a common artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has haste, and it has an equip cost of 1. The boost this offers for casting cost and the equip cost is pretty reasonable, as paying 1 more to give something new haste and +1/+0 will feel pretty good sometimes, especially in a set where there's an equipment archetype, and there is in red-white, giving this a C. Next up, it's Brazen Dwarf, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 Dwarf Shaman at common, and whenever you roll 1 or more dice, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. I don't think this looks great. A 2-mana 1/3 isn't a good stat line these days, and the fact it might damage your opponent a little bit doesn't really make up for that for me. It just won't do enough to feel worth the mana or the card in most decks. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Burning Hands, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that permanent is green, it deals 6 damage instead. As we've seen with most of this cycle, this is a pretty good card even without the color hosing effect. Normally, 2 mana to do 2 to something at instant speed would probably be a C+. It isn't quite premium just because it can only kill small stuff and not that efficiently. However, I do think adding the huge upside against green permanents is a huge deal, as when you go against a green deck, this will feel like a B+. Overall, I think this means that this gets a B-. Next up, it's Chaos Channeler, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 human shaman at uncommon, and when it attacks, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you exile the top card of your library, you may play it this turn. If you roll a 10 through 19, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, you may play them this turn. And if you roll a 20, you exile the top 3 cards of your library, you may play them this turn. This is really strong. It's a 4 mana 4/3 with a ton of upside. No matter what you roll when it attacks, you will end up netting at least 1 card, and because it says play, you can even play lands off of it, and that's good. He might die after only 1 attack, but you'll usually be getting at least a 2-for-1 out of it, so that's fine with me, especially because if left unchecked, the Channeler will just keep drawing you cards. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Critical Hit, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gains double strike until end of turn, and when you roll a natural 20, return Critical Hit from your graveyard to your hand. 2 mana for double strike alone isn't the best trick. The creature you use it on generally already has to be fairly impressive for it to be worthwhile, and it won't even always allow you to win combat if your creature isn't big enough. It is easy to imagine using this on your 6/6 Trampler, and that will happen sometimes, but you have to think of all the situations where the effect is negligible, which will be the majority of the time. The whole natural 20 thing is funny, but won't happen often enough for that to factor into the grade very much. I think this is just a D. Next up, it's Delena Wild Mage, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/2 legendary elf shaman at rare. When she attacks, you target a creature you control and roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 14, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary and it has exile this creature at end of combat. If you roll 15 to 20, you create one of those tokens and then roll again. So a 4 mana 3/2 that makes a temporary attacking copy of another creature when it attacks is nice enough, and in this case, Delena can actually target herself, because the copy won't be legendary. Mostly, she'll just be making 1 copy, but that's already a fairly potent card. If you hit 15 to 20, she'll just get silly, and she'll make at least 2 copies. She is fragile, and sometimes she won't have any friends it is worth making a copy of, but it seems like she'll shake up the board state significantly most of the time when she comes down, giving her a B. Next up, it's Dragon's Fire, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may reveal a dragon card from your hand, or choose a dragon you control. Dragon's Fire deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If you revealed a dragon card or chose a dragon as you cast this spell, Dragon's Fire deals damage equal to the power of that card or creature instead. 2 mana for 3 damage is always premium removal, and this has some pretty relevant dragon upside that can make it an even better removal spell. This set has a significant number of dragons. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Dueling Rapier, which for 1 red mana is a common artifact equipment with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control, and that creature gets +2/+0, and it has an equip cost of 4. So the equip cost here is obviously really steep, and +2/+0 for a single red mana would not be an awesome combat trick, but in this case, we're talking about a combat trick that has the stats boost stick around in one form or another. Even if your creature dies, you have something on the battlefield, even if it does cost a lot to equip, and if you can help a creature win and survive combat and keep this equipped to it, it's going to feel amazing. In a lot of ways, it is still a glorified combat trick, but I've underestimated auras and equipment with Flash in the past, dismissing them as combat tricks, and I think this will defy expectations. Still, it probably isn't much more than a solid playable, giving it a C. Next up, it's Earth Cult Elemental, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/6 elemental at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, each player sacrifices a permanent. If you roll a 10 through 19, each opponent sacrifices a permanent, and if you roll a 20, each opponent sacrifices 2 permanents. This offers some decent top-of-the-curve stats for limited, and it has a pretty nice d20 ability. It won't be awesome to roll 1 through 9, but the effect is at least symmetrical. It will be true that sometimes it doesn't hurt your opponent as much as it hurts you, but the opposite will sometimes be true too. Then the effect is one-sided if you roll a 10 or more, which will be well worth the mana you spend. If you always roll 10 to 20 with it, it would probably be a really good common in the set, but unfortunately it won't go that way all the time. We have to think about the fail cases too. The presence of treasure in this set also means your opponent will have more permanents than normal to sacrifice, so this is probably held to a C. Next up, it's Faraday's Fireball, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a common instant that deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you roll a d20. If you roll 1 through 9, it deals 2 damage to each player. If you roll a 10 through 20, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. I think this sneaks into the lower range of premium removal. 5 mana to do 5 to something at instant speed is perhaps not the most efficient thing ever, but it does kill most stuff, and the fact that your opponent also always takes 2 is enough to nudge this into the premium range for me. Sure, it will do 2 to you sometimes too, but that's okay. This is the kind of card that will plummet in its score if the format turns out to be super fast, so keep that in mind, but for now, it's a B-. Next up, it's Flame Skull, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 3/1 skeleton at Mythic Rare. It's got flying and it can't block, and when it dies, you exile it. If you do, you also exile the top card of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play one of those cards. This has nice aggressive flying stats to begin with. If that's all this was, it would be a very playable card, but the rejuvenation ability here is big. Either you can just cast Flame Skull again and keep pressuring your opponent in the air, or you can cast whatever other card got exiled. I suspect casting Flame Skull will be the right move more often than not, but sometimes he'll hit something really good that you'll have to cast, at which point this is a 3 mana 3/1 with flying that drew you a card. This set does have a lot of dragons, and that may keep Flame Skull in check a little bit, but he still seems quite good to me, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Goblin Javelineer, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Warrior at common. It's got haste, and when it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to target creature blocking it. This probably won't be great in Limited. A 1 mana 1/1 with haste might feel reasonable on turn 1, but it's pretty terrible thereafter, and adding the ability to ping things that block it doesn't really make up for that, though it does help some since it means that it can at least trade with X2s, and X1s effectively can't block it. There will be a pretty gross combo involving the Black Talisman in this Goblin, since once you give the thing Death Touch, it is basically impossible to block, but overall, I think you cut this more than you play it. I'm giving it a D+. Next, it's Goblin Morningstar, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has trample, and it has an equip cost of 1 generic and a red, and when it enters the battlefield, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you get a 1/1 red goblin creature token. If you roll a 10 through 20, you get a 1/1 red goblin creature token, and you attach the Morningstar to it. This looks like some pretty good equipment. While the stats boost isn't incredible or anything, adding trample does mean it will be nice to put on medium to large creatures, and the fact you get a 1/1 goblin when you play it is quite nice, really making up for other inefficiencies. It equipping to that goblin certainly is nice too, especially as a 2-drop. I'm kind of tempted to go with a B- here, but I do think it falls a little short. +1/+0 just isn't much of a boost for 2 mana, even if it does add trample. I think in the end I'm going with a C+ here. Next up, it's Hoarding Ogre, which for 3 generic and a red is an ogre at common, and when it attacks, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you get a treasure token. If you roll 10 through 19, you get 2 treasure tokens, and if you roll a 20, you get 3 treasure tokens. This has Hill Giant stats and a serviceable attack trigger. Because it makes treasure, you can really count this creature as fixing, and that's typically a valuable thing to have in Limited, plus this set has some nice treasure payoffs. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 2/3 goblin rogue at rare. Other goblins you control get +1/+1, and you can pay 1 red and tap it to deal damage equal to the number of goblins that enter the battlefield under your control this turn to any target. As we've already seen in this video, this set has a lot of goblins, so the Bandit Leader's Lord effect alone would make it a pretty playable card. The other ability is where things get interesting though. Even if you can just do 1 damage at a time with it, it's a pretty nice ability to have around, and if you play one of several cards that puts multiple goblin tokens on the table, shocking stuff won't be hard to accomplish either. The ability, of course, won't always be active, even in a deck with several goblins, so keep that in mind. But still, I think the reasonable floor of a 3 mana 2/3 and the very high ceiling of a Goblin Lord that can act as removal or reach damage is a nice card. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Hobgoblin Captain, which for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 Goblin Barbarian at common, and when it attacks, if you attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater this combat, Hobgoblin Captain gains first strike until end of turn. This looks like a good 2-drop for aggressive red decks in the format. A 2 mana 3/1 is already playable in a lot of formats, and because he supplies half the power necessary to make pack tactics go off, it seems likely he will have first strike a decent chunk of the time. For now, I think I want to start him at a C, but if aggro is big in this format, he probably moves up. Next, it's Hulking Bugbear, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 goblin at uncommon, and it has haste. Anytime we see a 3 mana 3/3 with haste, it tends to be a pretty solid aggressive creature, though certainly not the most exciting card ever, but it's definitely efficient. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Improvised Weaponry, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It deals 2 damage to any target, and you make a treasure token. This isn't quite premium removal, given that it does 2 for 3 mana and is a sorcery. However, the fact it can hit the opponent and it is a removal spell that gives you fixing and ramp is somewhat appealing, even if it won't be that efficient. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Inferno of the Star Mounts, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/6 legendary dragon at Mythic Rare. It can't be countered, it has flying and haste, and it has fire breathing. In other words, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each red mana you pay, and when its power becomes 20 this way, it deals 20 damage to any target. Like the other dragons in this cycle, Inferno of the Star Mounts is pretty frightening. In Limited, the 20 power part will basically never happen, but a 6 mana 6/6 with flying, haste, and fire breathing will end the game in a hurry. The fact it can't be countered is some nice additional value too. While it doesn't always do something, even if it gets killed, having haste goes a long way towards making sure something will happen the turn he comes down. The efficiency here will just put a really fast clock on your opponent, and I think that's enough for this to get into the lower range of bomb territory. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Jaded Sellsword, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 Dragon Warrior at common. When it enters the battlefield, if mana from a treasure was spent to cast it, it gains first strike and haste until end of turn. A 4 mana 4/3 is passable, and the treasure upside here is nice. It will make it a formidable attacker the turn it comes down. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Kick in the Door, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery. It says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains haste until end of turn and can't be blocked by walls this turn. Venture into the dungeon. This card reminds me a lot of some of the cards we saw in Strixhaven, which seemed like they didn't really do that much, but it turned out learning for 1 or 2 mana was good, even if the other effect wasn't big. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at here. Without Venture, this would probably be a D, or maybe worse. 1 mana for a counter in haste, and not being able to be blocked by a few creatures just wouldn't be worth a whole card. But with Venture attached, you suddenly have a card that will feel sort of like Guiding Voice from Strixhaven. It will make a new creature able to attack right away, or make an old one able to attack things to the counter, while also netting you some value from Venture. I think all of that makes this a C. Next up, it's Magic Missile, which for 1 generic and 2 red is an uncommon sorcery. It can't be countered, and it deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. This is premium removal. These types of spells that let you divide damage are always great because you can sometimes take down multiple creatures with them at once. And this can also just kill X3s reasonably efficiently, or even go after the opponent to help you close out a game. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Meteor Swarm, which for X and 3 red is a rare sorcery, and it deals 8 damage divided as you choose among X target creatures and or planeswalkers. Well, this is really good. At worst, you pay 4 to kill your opponent's big creature, and if your opponent has a bunch of small guys in play, you can pay more to pick them all off. I think it falls a little short from being a bomb, but it certainly is premium removal and will be able to reshape many games. The one downside is the triple red, but because you probably won't use this until later in the game anyway, you have time to find it. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Minion of the Mighty, which for 1 red mana is a 0/1 kobold. At rare, it's got Menace, and with its Pack Tactics effect, you get to put a dragon creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. This set does have a bunch of dragons in it, but I think setting this up so that Pack Tactics triggers will be pretty darn hard, and will sometimes feel like a win more type effect than anything. If you're attacking with 6 power worth of stuff, there's a good chance you're already in a good position to win the game. Sure, if you're desperate, this can get you a dragon down for free, but how much of a discount will it be? Really, by the time you're attacking that hard, you're typically going to have plenty of mana in your typical game of Limited, and if you take the Pack Tactics effects away from this card, it's terrible, and I think that's mostly what it is. I'm giving it a D-. Next up, it's Orb of Dragon Kind, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. Spend this mana only to cast dragon spells or activate abilities of dragons. You can also pay 1 red and tap it and sacrifice it to look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal a dragon card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. There are enough dragons in this set for this to provide some real fixing for you, and having the fail case of helping you find a dragon, which is presumably one of your better cards, is pretty nice. I think most red decks will find themselves with enough dragons to make this a reasonable playable, and sometimes it may even help you to splash an off-color dragon. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Plundering Barbarian, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 dwarf barbarian at common. When it enters the battlefield, you choose one. You can destroy an artifact or make a treasure token. This seems fine. This format has enough artifacts that this will have something to target often enough with Smash the Chest, and when you don't, it provides some reasonable fixing for you with Pry It Open. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Price of Loyalty, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It says gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn. If mana from a treasure was spent to cast this spell, that creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So even with the treasure upside, this won't be worth it in most decks. Threat and effects aren't amazing in most formats since they tend to do very little except in 2 situations. One of these is that you're able to kill your opponent when you do it, and the other is that you have some sacrifice outlets that make it easy to turn this effect into a removal spell that gives you some value. In your typical deck in the format, that's just going to be a D. But while there isn't a sacrificing archetype in this set exactly, there are 2 cards, one at common and one at uncommon in black, that allow you to sacrifice a creature either for free or cheaply. And that means if you get like 4 of those, suddenly Price of Loyalty is going to look pretty good. And I think overall that means, it's sort of a build around. I think in a deck that gets the right black creatures to sacrifice the creature you steal, it's probably a C. Next up, it's Red Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 dragon. At uncommon, it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. Like the rest of this cycle, this looks like a nice card. A 6 mana 4/4 flyer is almost passable, and the fact this does 4 to your opponent is kind of a big deal, as it will really accelerate their clock, and the times when it allows you to finish off your opponent will feel especially good. I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Rust Monster, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/1 beast. At uncommon, it's got First Strike, and it has Sacrifice an Artifact. Rust Monster gets +2/+0 until end of turn. There are enough artifacts in this set that Rust Monster will be quite imposing on some boards. This is especially true because red has so much treasure. Even the starting point, a 3 mana 2/1 with First Strike, isn't bad, but anytime you attack with artifacts in play, your opponent is going to have a really hard decision to make. I think the monster is well supported enough in this set that it's pretty strong. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Swarming Goblin, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/3 goblin at common. When it enters the battlefield, you roll a d20. 1 through 9 gives you 1 goblin token, 10 through 19 gives you 2 of them, and 20 gives you 3. This is a nice 5-drop. The worst case is 5 mana for a 4/3 and a 1/1, and that's kind of a passable card. If you get 2 tokens out of this, it's going to feel well worth the investment, and obviously on the rare occasions you hit 20, you're going to feel like you're robbing the bank. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Tiger Tribe Hunter, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 human barbarian at uncommon. It's got Trample, and it's got Pack Tactics, and when you meet that power 6 or greater requirement, Tiger Tribe Hunter can deal damage equal to a sacrificed creature's power to another target creature. This doesn't have the most impressive stats around for a 5-drop, but since it is a 4/4 with Pack Tactics, it doesn't need a whole lot of help to trigger it, and when you do, it'll feel pretty good. Flinging something at one of your opponent's creatures can be a pretty good ability, though it isn't the kind that you'll always be able to make use of. This is another card, though, that's quite good with that threaten effect. It is especially nice that she doesn't have to stick to only flinging the creatures who are attacking, so you can play a new creature and use it to kill off an opposing blocker, suddenly making your attack a real problem for your opponent. Now, sacrificing a creature is a real cost to be sure, but when that ability does its thing, it is going to feel pretty great. The baseline here is a little bit rough, and the ability won't always work out, but I think this does do enough to be a pretty high quality playable, though I think it does fall a little short of being something I want to first pick, giving it a C+. Next, it's Unexpected Windfall, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you discard a card, and you draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. This seems decent to me. Most red decks are going to want 1 copy of this. 4 mana is a lot for Tormenting Voice, but the 2 treasure you get means this card also gives you some very real fixing, in addition to helping you dig deeper into your deck. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Valor Singer. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 2/3 Tiefling Bard at common, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This type of effect is always better than it looks. I mean, on his own, he's effectively a 3 mana 3/3 when he's attacking, and you'll often have other creatures which you can use the ability on that might have more of an impact. It also gets a little bit of a boost by Pack Tactics being a big focus, especially in red-green. This seems like a pretty nice playable to me. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Wish, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare sorcery, and it says you may play a card you own from outside the game this turn. These type of effects usually aren't that good in Limited. You have to have something worth grabbing in your sideboard, but this isn't Strixhaven. You're not going to have a bunch of good options in there. Mostly this will cost 3 mana to grab some mediocre card out of your sideboard, and keep in mind that you have to cast that spell that turn, unlike most Wish effects, which put a card directly into your hand. In other words, this is even worse than other Wishes we've seen in Limited. One kind of interesting thing here is that if you draft basic lands, you can sort of use it as fixing, but it isn't exactly good at that either. I think this is probably just unplayable. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Zorn, who for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 elemental at rare. If you would create 1 or more treasure tokens, instead create those tokens plus an additional treasure token. This has passable stats, and its ability to multiply treasure will definitely come up sometimes, especially in black-red, but don't expect that to always come up. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's You Come to the Null Camp, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it has 2 options. One is up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn, and the other is target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn. Like most of this cycle, this has 2 effects that are good in the right situation, but are both pretty narrow. Putting them together does make for a better card, and sometimes aggro decks really want a card that just blinks a couple of blockers. And they're also pretty happy with a combat trick, even if this one isn't the greatest. The lack of significant toughness boost makes it a challenge for this to help your creatures survive combats, but that's alright. The first copy of this seems like a decent inclusion for red aggro decks, I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's You Find Some Prisoners, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. It says choose 1, destroy target artifact, or exile the top 3 cards of target opponent's library. Choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. I think this is a bit underwhelming compared to the other uncommon Choose Your Adventure style cards. If you can hit an artifact with this, it'll be nice, but the second ability is a little too random, though it certainly will be useful most of the time in the later game, as it effectively draws you a card, but doing that for 2 mana isn't great. Still, You Find Some Prisoners is likely to sit in your hand for a long time before it actually does something, and even when it does do something, it normally isn't going to feel that powerful. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's You See a Pair of Goblins, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says choose 1. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn, or create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. This is a nice modal card. If you're not going wide enough, you can make a couple of goblins with it at instant speed, and if you are wide enough, it's Trumpet Blast. Neither of those cards are incredible, but jamming them both onto the same card is good, and really helps make a go-wide deck viable. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Zalto, Fire Giant Duke, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 7/3 legendary giant barbarian at rare. It's got trample, and when it's dealt damage, you venture into the dungeon. So, you may have noticed we got all the way through red before actually getting to a card that does anything with dungeons, and in general, that means that red cards that do stuff with dungeons aren't going to be quite as good as they are in other colors, and that's because other colors can make a critical mass of venturing happen, and thus they're able to complete dungeons and get various effects. This is literally the only red card that does anything with dungeons. Obviously, if you're paired with another color that does have dungeon stuff going on, and those colors that have a lot of dungeon stuff going on are white, black, and blue, then, it could matter. But in a lot of ways, it does weaken Zalto, just the fact that within his own color, he's only going to ever be able to get you to room 1 of one of these dungeons, and that's not that great. And just to talk about the dungeons a little bit, in case you haven't seen the other videos in this review, these aren't cards you draft, they just exist outside of the game, and when you venture into a dungeon, you just pick one and you go into the first room, and that means you either gain 1 life, scry 1, or each player loses 1 life. But even though it's really the only card in red that does stuff with dungeons, Zalto has a really good baseline because he's just a 5-mana 7/3 with trample. And that means it's going to be a really effective attacker that your opponent probably kills but takes some damage in the process, and then you get one of these effects, whether it's scrying 1 or gaining 1 life, or each player loses 1 life. Ideally, you're getting something more powerful than that because you've been venturing with other cards, but in general, red just doesn't have a lot of it, and we'll see green doesn't have a lot of venturing going on either. It's really concentrated in the Esper colors. But still, this is a huge trampling creature that will do a bunch of damage and give you some value when it gets damaged, and I think that means it's a B. Next up, it's Zariel, Archduke of Avernus, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Zariel at Mythic Rare. She has a +1 that says creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. She has a 0 ability that makes a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target, and she has an emblem that says you get an emblem with, at the end of the first combat phase on your turn, untap target creature you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. This is a pretty strong planeswalker for 4 mana. Importantly, she can protect herself a little bit with devil tokens. Devil tokens are some of the most obnoxious tokens around, and they can really make it difficult for an opponent to attack you, as they can enable 2-for-1s more often than you might think. The other 2 abilities are less impressive, but the +1 can help you do a ton of damage fast, and the ultimate, while somewhat dependent on you having a board state, can definitely win you the game. I think Zerial does enough to get into the lower range of bomb status. I'm giving Zerial an A-. Alright, Zerial was our last red card. We're moving into green now. Our first green card is Boulette, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 beast at common, and at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. We've seen a lot of creatures like this in the past, and they're not usually anything amazing, though their ability to grow throughout the game is nice, and they do eventually become a problem for your opponent. Because it counts the death of any creature, you will find that this gains that counter a decent chunk of the time. It is a little lame that it only counts on your own turn, but I still think this is a C. Next up, it's Bull's Strength, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn, untap it. Like most versions of this that we've seen, it's alright. The boost it gives will allow you to win combat, and trample will even allow you to do some damage out of nowhere. The untap clause also gives a creature pseudo-vigilance, or allows you to ambush an opposing creature that's attacking you, though like with most tricks, you generally prefer to use it offensively, but the additional flexibility doesn't hurt. It is still a trick, and comes with all those inherent risks I always talk about. It's situational, and if things go wrong, you get blown out with a 2-for-1, but I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Choose Your Weapon, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Double target creature's power and toughness until end of turn, or this spell deals 5 damage to target creature with flying. Both options here are super underwhelming, and will only be useful and efficient in some very specific situations, but like with all of these cards, putting 2 situational effects together really does make for a significantly better card, as the situations where you can use that card are drastically increased, even with a card that has 2 incredibly situational options. Sometimes you'll find yourself doing lethal with 2-weapon fighting, or helping trigger a pack tactics ability, and maybe just winning combat too. And sometimes you'll find yourself killing an opposing flyer fairly efficiently. I think that makes this a solid card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Circle of Dreams Druid, which costs 3 green mana for a 2/1 Elf Druid at rare, and you can tap it to add green for each creature you control. The mana requirement here is steep. Having 3 green mana in the early going is very difficult, and by the later part of the game when you probably can cast this and make a bunch of mana with it, you might not have anything to do with the mana. If you're in a mono green deck, obviously this would be incredible, but doing that is usually pretty hard and limited, and I don't know that it would be worth doing for only 1 copy of Circle of Dreams Druid. Overall, I think this is just solid, mostly because the mana is challenging. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Circle of the Moon Druid, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/4 human elf druid at common, and on your turn, it's a bear with base power and toughness 4/2, but on your opponent's turn, it's a 2/4. A card that is always a 3 mana 4/2 is like a C-, and a card that's always a 3 mana 2/4 is a D+. This gives you the best of both of those, as you'd rather have the 4/2 as the attacker and the 2/4 as the blocker most of the time. That makes this fine, giving it a C. Next up, it's Compelled Duel, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn and must be blocked this turn if able. I'm never a huge fan of this type of card. It isn't hard to get 2-for-1 when you cast it, and it's way situational. However, this is cheaper than most versions of this we've seen. +3/+3 is going to be enough to make just about any creature into a problem, though keep in mind that your opponent only needs to use 1 blocker here. It isn't that all creatures have to block, just 1 does. So, you need to end up in situations where the 3 damage either wins you the game, or allows you to take down an important creature. But a lot of the time, their important creatures will just be attacking you, and they can just throw a token in front of this. And this doesn't grant trample or anything like that, so it's kind of like very specific risky removal with minor upside for creatures that already have trample, but it's still not very good. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Direwolf Prowler, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 wolf at common. You can pay 1 generic and a green to give it +2/+2 in haste, but you can only activate that ability once each turn. This starts out as a Grey Ogre, which is abysmal these days, and while it has a decent activated ability that can make it a 4/4 with haste, I don't think that does enough to be saved from being a card you cut significantly more often than you play. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Druid Class, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment class. At level 1, this one says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. At level 2, it says you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and you get there for 2 generic and a green. And at level 3, which you can get to for 4 generic and a green, says when this class becomes level 3, target land you control becomes a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. It's still a land. I'm not super impressed with this class. Gaining a life for every land isn't worth a card, and while this does level up, Neither of the things it levels up into are super impressive. Playing more than one land a turn is pretty hard to take advantage of after the very early game because you just want to have extra lands, and if you do, you're probably flooding. Level 3 is where you finally get something that is worth a whole card in limited, but you paid a total of 10 mana to get there, and the final product is just a big vanilla creature. Yes, the fact you pay installments matters, but overall, I don't think Druid Class is much more than a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. It is worth noting it has some upside, especially in the life gain deck and in the ramp deck, but I still don't see it being that impressive. Next up, it's Eliwick Tumblestrum, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a legendary planeswalker Eliwick at Mythic Rare, and it starts with 4 loyalty. Her +1 says venture into the dungeon. Her -2 says look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. If it's legendary, you gain 3 life. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And she has an emblem, a -7 emblem that says creatures you control have trample and haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed. So Eliwick's main strength is her ability to allow you to pretty rapidly go through a dungeon, which will give you a lot of value and allow you to make your cards better, especially the ones that check to see if you've completed them. Her -2 isn't bad either, as it does let you dig for a creature, and you'll sometimes even gain life. Her ultimate is good, and synergizes well with the +1, as she is very likely to tick up and help you complete at least one dungeon, and if she's left unchecked, the ultimate will give a pretty nice boost. Now, there are some very real downsides here. She does nothing at all to protect herself, and she has to tick down to draw you cards. There will be times where you just can't play Eliwick effectively, because your board state needs to already be pretty well constructed for her to get going. I think that keeps her from being a bomb, though she's still quite good. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's Eltergard Ranger, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/1 human elf ranger at common. It's got reach, and when it enters the battlefield, it makes a 2/2 green wolf creature token. So for 5 mana, you get a 4/1 and a 2/2. In other words, 6/3 worth of stats. A 5 mana 6/3 wouldn't be good, but spreading it across 2 bodies makes it pretty interesting. Plus, a 4/1 with reach has the kind of size to take down some of the dragons in this set, and that definitely matters. It feels like you'll be able to get a 2-for-1 out of this a decent chunk of the time, and I think most green decks will be pretty interested in the first copy, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Find the Path, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura. It's an enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon. An enchanted land has tap, add 2 green mana. I think you're getting pretty solid value here between getting some ramp and venturing into a dungeon. Venture won't always feel like drawing a card, but later on in the dungeons it will give you that kind of value, and even the early rooms in the dungeon seem decent enough. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Froghemoth, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 frog horror at rare. It's got trample and haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, exile up to that many cards from their graveyard. Put a +1/+1 counter on Froghemoth. For each creature card exiled this way, you gain 1 life for each non-creature card exiled this way. So if you can just play this and bash for 4 with it, which is possible thanks to haste, you're going to feel pretty great about the situation, as it is likely it gets at least 1 counter and gains you some life, and things will sort of snowball from there, although your opponent does have to have cards to exile for him to do his thing. Even if you don't end up with that ideal situation, you have a sizable creature with trample that your opponent has to account for, and while sometimes it just won't be able to attack, it will pretty much always be something of a threat to them. I'm giving Froghemoth a B. Next up, it's Null Hunter, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Null at common. It has a Pack Tactics ability, and it gains a +1/+1 counter when you attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater, and the Null attacks too. This is a fine 2-drop. It's a bear as a baseline, and it can get bigger if it has enough friends. That's good enough upside for this to be a pretty nice 2-drop for green decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Green Dragon, which for 4 generic and 2 green is an uncommon dragon. With flying, it's a 4/4, and when it enters the battlefield until end of turn, whenever a creature an opponent controls is dealt damage, destroy it. This whole cycle's nice, and the Green Dragon doesn't disappoint. A 6 mana 4/4 flyer is often borderline playable, but its Into the Battlefield trigger is also going to be a huge headache for people to contend with. Now, there will be some board states where it doesn't do much, but the card has a reasonable baseline and will sometimes set up situations where your opponent just has to block to not die, which means they lose their creatures. I think this does enough to get into the lower range of a card you would first pick. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Hill Giant Herd Gorger, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/6 giant at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. This seems like a fine finisher for green, especially at common. You're probably going to hope you have a rare or uncommon in that slot, but this card is similar enough to Ravenous Lindworm and Honey Mammoth to make me feel like it has a nice shot at being solid. Gaining life also gives you some extra synergy in the green-white deck. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Hunter's Mark, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets a blue permanent you don't control, it can't be countered, and target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn, then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. So this is really good. It's kind of like Hunt the Weak. It doesn't give a permanent counter, but unlike Hunt the Weak, it's an instant, and it has insane blue hosing upside that will make it really silly sometimes. Being an instant is important, because the downside with fight spells is that you have to find a window to play it where there is a minimal chance your opponent can interact, because if they can, you're getting blown out. An instant can find those windows a lot more flexibly than a sorcery can. And then, obviously, when you're only paying 1 mana for this, it's going to be completely absurd. Green has plenty of creatures who will be good with this effect. I think this would probably be a C+ or a B- if it was without its blue upside. I think with the blue upside, it's a B. Something you can take really highly and certainly premium removal. Next up, it's Inspiring Bard, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 elf bard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose 1. You either give +2/+2 until end of turn to a creature, or you gain 3 life. A creature with just the Bardic Inspiration ability is usually an okay playable, but it does come with the downside of not doing anything when a +2/+2 boost just doesn't matter, like if you have to play defense or don't have another creature. Adding the Song of Rest option means that in those situations, you get an ability that is far more useful, and that's pretty nice. It probably still isn't more than a solid playable, I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Instrument of the Bards, which for 1 green mana is a rare legendary artifact, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep you may put a Harmony counter on Instrument of the Bards. You can pay 3 generic and a green and tap it to search your library for a creature card with mana value equal to the number of Harmony counters on Instrument of the Bards, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If that card is legendary, create a treasure token, then shuffle. This seems like it's really hard to make work in Limited. For one thing, in the early game, you won't really be interested in using it, as adding to your board more immediately will be far better than just tutoring something up. And that means that playing this on turn 1 isn't going to feel very good, and it will just sit around unused. I guess if you can't do anything early, it will probably be an okay thing to have around, but you're still going to be in a lot of trouble. Even with this, if you aren't able to add to your board at all on turns 2 through 4. It does get a little bit interesting in the later part of the game, like using it to find your 6 mana finisher or something, but even then, it's a very slow card. So what you're looking at here is still a very particular tutor, and one that you don't actually have that much control over. The mana cost has to be equal to what you search up, not less than or equal, and obviously you can stop putting counters on this when it reaches a certain point, but you're still only going to be able to search up so many cards in your deck, and a lot of the time it's not going to be worth that 4 mana. I think in the end, this is unplayable and limited, giving it an F. Next up, it's Intrepid Outlander, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/3 Orc Ranger at uncommon. It's got reach, and it has pack tactics. In this case, you get to venture into the dungeon. This starts out with some nice base stats. Reach tends to perform pretty well in Limited, especially in colors that don't have that much access to green, and obviously the pack tactics trigger here is quite powerful. Venturing into dungeons is going to be the source of a ton of value in this format, and Intrepid Outlander can help you do it sometimes. And while green has less venturing going on than the Esper colors do, it has enough that venturing will get you through more than one room most of the time. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Loathsome Troll, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 6/2 troll at uncommon. It has an activated ability that you can pay 3 generic and a green to roll a d20 if it's in your graveyard. If you roll a 1 through 9, you put it on top of your library. 10 through 19 puts it into your hand, and a 20 puts it onto the battlefield tapped. A 5 mana 6/2 is not very good, though it does make pack tactics get going all on its own, and that is certainly relevant in this format. Still, a 2-drop can block it and take it down. The good news is, if you have the time and the mana, it has a solid ability it can use from the graveyard. It going on top of your library isn't amazing, since you have to replace your draw to get it back, and there's a reasonable chance what you were going to draw might be better, but when it returns to your hand, it will feel pretty good, and obviously, that's true when it goes to the battlefield as well. Still, this doesn't have the best stats ever, even accounting for pack tactics, and its ability is both expensive and going to feel actively mediocre when you roll a 1 through 9. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Long Rest, which costs X and 3 green mana. It's a rare sorcery, and it says return X target cards with different mana values from your graveyard to your hand. If 8 or more cards were returned to your hand this way, your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. Exile Long Rest. This is pretty bad for most of the game, since you need a bunch of mana and the right mix of mana values in your graveyard for it to do something. However, it does seem like a pretty nice card in the late game. Paying 6 and getting 3 things back with it isn't a crazy thing to expect. Of course, it is a sorcery, and you don't often have time to use up all your mana on a turn and not add to the board at all, so that's not so good. And also, don't ever expect it to change your life total. However, if you make it to your next turn after using this, you'll probably be in a good position. I think it's probably just a C, just because it will vary wildly depending on the stage of the game, and it's mostly just going to be bad. Next up, it's Lurking Roper, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/5 horror at uncommon. It doesn't untap during your untap step, and when you gain life, you can untap it. This seems really good. You would basically always end up playing a 3-mana 4/5 with Defender. That might sound a little weird, but the main reason walls tend to not be great in Limited isn't just because they can't attack, it's because they can't block and kill things. But the Roper can definitely do that. A 4/5 is going to be a brick wall that can just kill most creatures that come its way. So even if that's all this was, I think the first copy would make the cut in most green decks. So when you add the bonus that it can actually attack, you've got a better card, and then you have a way to actually untap it too, and it's even better. Even if you could never untap it, it's going to be a pretty nice card, and if you can, and you'll be able to if you're playing green, it's going to be awesome. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Neverwinter Dryad, which is a 1 green for a 1/1 creature Dryad at common. You can pay 2 and sack it to search your library for a forest, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. This is a fine 1-drop. It's basically a bad version of Sakura Tribe-Elder, but being a bad version of an excellent card isn't too bad. It ramps for you, and that looks to be a good strategy in this format, especially in blue-green, and it dies too, which is good for the black-green deck, which has various morbid effects. It's nice that if you play it early, it can actually attack a little too. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Ochre Jelly, which for X and a green is a 0/0 ooze at rare. It's got trample, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. And when it dies, if it had 2 or more +1/+1 counters on it, create a token that's a copy of it at the beginning of the next instep. The token enters the battlefield with half that many +1/+1 counters on it, rounded down. Creatures that scale like this can be nice and limited because you can play them early if you really need a body, and in the late game they can be absolutely massive, something that pairs really well with trample. I mean, if you play it on turn 3, it's a 3-mana 2/2 that leaves behind a 1/1, and that's a card you'd play most of the time. And, as I said, it scales all game long, leaving behind more and more formidable tokens that will also leave behind other tokens if they have enough counters. The mana investment is big, but this will usually give you more than enough. I think Ochre Jelly gets into the lower part of bomb tier. It can be huge, it has an evasive ability, and it will give you something even if it dies right away in most cases. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Old Gnawbone, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 legendary dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you create that many treasure tokens. A 7-mana 7/7 flyer is certainly imposing, but it better be for that cost. One nice thing here is that you will be able to get treasure out of this the turn you play it, so even if your opponent kills it on their turn, there's a good chance you're going to get some treasure immediately. Of course, the problem here is that you probably don't really need treasure if you were able to cast Old Gnawbone, and while this format does seem to have a significant number of mana sinks, I'm just not sure you'll have anything to do with all the treasure he produces. I'm giving him a B. I still think he's a pretty good card, but he definitely pales in comparison to the other dragons in his cycle. Next up, it's Owlbear, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 bird bear at common. It has trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. This is reminiscent of Serulf's Packmate, and that's a good green common to emulate. This gives you a very real body. A 4/4 with trample can be relevant on many board states, but obviously the inter-battlefield draw a card effect is what makes this great. It will be virtually impossible for you not to get a 2-for-1 out of this bear bird, and the value it gives you will be great. Sure, costing 5 does mean you can only run so many, unlike the Packmate, which had Foretell, making it much easier to jam a bunch of them into your deck, but you should value the first 1 to 2 copies of this pretty highly. I'm giving it a B. There's a good chance that it's green's best common. Next up, it's Plummet, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant that says destroy target creature with flying. It's kind of weird to see this card here. We really don't see sideboard cards very much anymore over the last couple of sets. So giving a sideboard grade isn't something I've done in this whole set review so far because there's all these modal cards that you can just put in your main deck that deal with certain things. But Plummet is a card you put in your sideboard, because if your opponent doesn't have several targets for it, it's terrible. So you can put it in your main deck if you're desperate, but in this day and age, it's really hard to find room for something like this because the average quality of cards has gone up. There aren't that many cards that are unplayable or bad anymore in limited formats. But if you have to play Plummet in your deck, it's probably a D. Enough people will have targets that it's okay. If your opponent has a bunch of flyers, including maybe some of the scary dragons in the set, you can side it in, and it's a C+. Next up, it's Prosperous Innkeeper, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 halfling citizen at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, it makes a treasure, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. A 2-mana 1/1 that gives you a treasure is already pretty decent. It gives you some real fixing and ramp, so adding the life gain effect to the Innkeeper makes for a pretty nice 2-drop for most green decks. This means it fits well into both the green-white life gain deck and the blue-green ramp deck. And it's nice that it can do both of those things well. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Purple Worm, which for 5 generic and 2 green is an 8/7 worm at uncommon. It costs 2 less to cast if a creature died this turn, and it has Ward 2. Even if you always paid 7 for this, it would be kind of okay, maybe like a C-, but it will frequently only cost 5. Adding Ward to a card like this really matters because the big downside with this kind of creature is that your opponent might be able to kill it for very little mana. Now, there's still a pretty good chance they can kill it for less than 7, but killing it for less than 5 won't be a common occurrence, and casting this for 5 doesn't seem like it will be super difficult to make happen. You know, on turn 5, creatures tend to die, and this is going to come down and be really scary. This seems like a good finisher for green decks. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Ranger Class, which for 1 generic and a green is an enchantment class at rare. When it enters the battlefield at level 1, you create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. You can pay 1 generic and a green to get it to level 2, at which point, when you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature, and at level 3, which you can get to for 3 generic and a green, you may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast creature spells from the top of your library. This looks really good, and I think in Limited at least, this is going to be the best of the classes. First of all, it adds to the board right away, unlike the other classes, and that makes the baseline here a 2-mana 2/2. Then it starts putting a counter on an attacking creature at level 2, which you can get to for only 2 mana, and level 3 can generate serious card advantage. The whole package is amazing and reasonably costed each step of the way. This kind of gives me Sparring Regimen vibes between the +1/+1 counter effect and all the extra value. And while it might not be the A+ that Sparring Regimen was, this is a very, very strong card that's going to win you a lot of games. It's a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Ranger's Longbow, which is not quite as good as the class. It's 1 generic and a green for a common artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+1 and has reach, and it has an equip cost of 3. This gives a reasonable boost in keyword for the cost, but it's not anything special. You won't play it all the time, but it'll make the cut every now and then, and it won't feel terrible. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Scaled Herbalist, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 Lizard Druid at common, and you can tap it to put a land card from your hand on the battlefield. When you get this down early, it'll feel pretty nice. It doesn't have the best stats, but you are likely to have at least 1 extra land, and that will be nice to take advantage of. In the mid to late game, it becomes increasingly useless, though, unless you're able to draw a whole bunch of cards. Giving this a C-. Next up, it's Spoils of the Hunt, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each mana from a treasure that was spent to cast this spell. Then that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. So, even without any treasure at all, this is a 3-mana Rabid-Bited instant speed, which is already a card I'd be interested in. It also compares pretty well with Ambuscade, a card that cost the same and always gave +1/+0 in addition to the punch effect. The treasure upside is nice because sometimes your creature won't have the power necessary to be good with Spoils of the Hunt, but if you're in green anyway, your creatures are probably already good with this. One does have to be cautious with spells like this, as your opponent removing the creature you target is an epic blowout, but because it's an instant, it won't be that hard to find an ideal window. I think this is premium removal, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sylvan Shepard, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 human druid at common, and it has vigilance, and when it attacks, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you gain 1 life. If you roll a 10 through 19, you gain 2 life, and if you roll a 20, you gain 5 life. This looks like it has a lot going on because of the d20 stuff, but it's basically just a 3-mana 2/3 with vigilance that gains you 1 or 2 life when it attacks. That's basically a textbook solid playable, especially in a format that has some life gain payoffs. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's the Tarask, which for 6 generic and 3 green is a 10/10 legendary dinosaur at Mythic Rare. It has haste and ward 10 as long as it was cast, and when it attacks, it fights target creature defending player control. So, off the bat, this costs 9 mana, and that is a pretty big problem. However, there is ramp in this format, and I think it will be doable in some decks to actually cast this, and if you do, it's going to be pretty hard for you to lose, because this creature is huge, it'll have haste, it has ward 10, which is basically hexproof, and when it attacks, it fights something. So once you start attacking with this, which you'll do the turn you play it, it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to win. 9 mana is a ton, and I think that's why we kind of have to give this a build around and say it's like a D plus in your typical deck, because your typical deck will get to 9 mana only very infrequently. But if you have access to significant ramp, and there is some, especially in blue-green, casting this and having it be your win condition is very real, and I think it's probably just an A in that kind of deck, because you can cast it a lot more consistently, and again, if you do, you're going to win. Next, it's Underdark Basilisk, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/2 Basilisk at common with Death Touch. It's pretty hard for small creatures with Death Touch not to be playable, since they bring the capability of trading with anything. This makes them relevant all game long, though never super impressive. They also tend to be good with fight and punch spells, which green has. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Varus Silvery Moon Ranger, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/3 Human Elf Ranger at rare. It's legendary, it's got Reach and Ward 1, and whenever you cast a creature or planeswalker spell, Venture into the Dungeon, this ability triggers only once each turn, and whenever you complete a dungeon, you make a 2/2 Green Wolf creature token. This is a 3-mana 3/3 with Reach that not only makes it very easy for you to trigger your dungeon rooms, but also turns out wolf tokens when you complete them. That's excellent. And hey, Ward 1 might not be the most exciting ward ever, but it does make him slightly harder to kill, so I'll take it. I think he does just enough to get into the lower range of bomb in this set. I'm giving him an A-. Next up, it's Wandering Troubadour, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/2 Dragon Bard at uncommon, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you had a land enter the battlefield under your control this turn, venture into the dungeon. While this isn't quite straight up landfall venture, it is a close approximation of that, and that seems pretty awesome. You have to wait to venture until the end of your turn, so if your opponent can kill the bard after you play the land, you won't get to venture, so keep that in mind when you play with and against this, but the fact that this can venture for you if you're hitting land drops is pretty awesome. A 4-mana 4/2 isn't exactly a world beater, but it is the kind of stat line that does trade pretty well with bigger creatures, so that's nice too. I think this is going to be something you take pretty highly. Venturing into dungeons for no mana at all is going to feel really good, giving it a B. Next, it's Werewolf Pack Leader, which for 2 green mana is a 3/3 human werewolf. At rare, it's got Pack Tactics, and you get to draw a card with this Pack Tactics trigger, and it has an ability that you can pay 3 generic and a green, and until end of turn, it has base power and toughness 5/3, gains trample, and isn't a human. This is a very good card. If you can play it on turn 2, it gives you some nice size in the early game, but it maintains very real relevance into the late game, thanks to its ability to draw you a card and turn into a full-on werewolf. When it does that, it also gives you 5 of the 6 power necessary to trigger Pack Tactics, which is a great added bonus. Even just drawing with this once and forcing a trade seems good, and sometimes it'll just run away with the game. I'm giving it a B+. Next, it's Wild Shape, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Until end of turn, target creature you control has that base power and toughness, becomes that creature type, and gains that ability. Those options are a 1/3 turtle with hexproof, a 1/5 spider with reach, or a 3/3 elephant with trample. I'm not usually a big fan of tricks that grant hexproof, they're just too situational. But this gets around that with some pretty nice modality. You can still get hexproof if you need it, but it has 2 other modes that can be useful in different situations, and having an option between those 3 things is pretty nice, though not anything special. A 1/5 with reach is probably just going to enable a block you didn't have before, which isn't a great thing to give up a card for most of the time, and making something into a 3/3 with trample won't always matter either, so the 1/3 option is the best one, but it does have a lot of flexibility for only 1 mana. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's You Find a Cursed Idol, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and has 3 options. One is Destroy Target Artifact, another is Destroy Target Enchantment, and yet another is Create a Treasure Token and Venture into the Dungeon. This seems like a solid card to me. The modality here is great, and most of the time if you can blow up an artifact or enchantment, that's where you're going to go. But it is great that it has a fail case of Venture plus Treasure, which won't always feel like a whole card's worth of value, but it'll get close. This is sort of like a Naturalize with cycling in that sense, and that's always a decent card. I'm giving this a C. Next, it's You Happen on a Glade, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, put them in your hand, and then shuffle, or return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. I like this. It gives green decks some really good fixing, and that's the option that will feel worthwhile the most often. However, one eventually reaches a stage in a game where top decking a fixing spell like this isn't what you want to be doing. And by that stage of the game, you probably also have something in your graveyard you'd love to get back. I don't see myself ever cutting the first copy of this in most green decks, especially if I'm splashing or straight up 3 colors. I'm giving it a C+. And our last green card in the last card in this card-by-card review is You Meet in a Tavern, which costs 2 generic and 2 green for an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose one. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of creature cards from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And the other option is creatures you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. Both options here can be quite powerful. Sometimes you really need to find yourself a couple creatures in your deck, and other times pumping the whole board will win you the game. This is a rather clunky sorcery, but both modes can be great in the right situation. I'm giving it a C+. So that does it for the card-by-card set review. I'm glad I managed to get it all done before most people, at least, were able to play the new format on Magic Arena. The set review isn't completely over yet. I'm still going to be doing an archetype guide as well as a top 10 video on the biggest bombs in the format, so keep your eyes out for those. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, including drafts of this new format, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.